Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so now I think all of the issues I will deal with are complex. It's impossible to try and deal with them in any kind of nuance in the space of 20 minutes. So this will obviously be just a surface glimpse of the kind of things that are happening and the kind of sort of churning and reawakening that's happening in different parts of the world, including, of course, in Auroville. So apologize for any simplistic things that I might end up saying because of shortage of time. Now, as Natasha have already said, we know that we're in the middle of multiple different crises, all of them intersecting in many ways. We can't talk about the ecological crisis unless we're also talking about things like inequality, and authoritarianism, and sort of the mindsets of development, and aspirations, and consumerism, and so on. So right from the sort of individual sense of alienation, etc., that hundreds of millions of people are facing across the world, to the global crisis of climate and biodiversity and so on. There are intersections, there are interconnections. So most of us are familiar with these. I'm not going into details. We also know that in the global south, in countries like India, development has come, of course, with benefits to many people like me, for instance, but it has also come as violence to the rest of nature, like you see in this advertisement of how nature is a barrier and it has to be removed for development to take place, or to people who are living in these landscapes or are dependent on these landscapes. In India alone, about 60 million people have been displaced, physically uprooted from their lands, for so-called development projects. And we also know that while the same system that has kind of furthered or engendered these sorts of problems um, initially denies that there is such a problem. There's no such thing as a ecological crisis, was said 20, 30 years back. There's no such thing as a climate crisis, was said till about 10, 15 years back. Even now, I guess this guy who's taken over in the US is still saying that. But it's very hard for the system to deny it now. There's just so much evidence, right? So now they're coming to us saying, okay, well, don't worry, we have the solutions. And part of the problem is that these solutions, which are techno fixes, like moving away from fossil fuel vehicles to electric vehicles without looking at the ecological land impact of that, as you see the lithium mining in this photograph, and without looking at the social impacts in terms of, who can afford an electric car, for instance, and ignoring what are really much more fundamental alternatives, which is what you see in the top right-hand side image of how many people can be carried by 100 cars versus one or two buses. So it's those sorts of systemic, more fundamental transformations that we have to look for, and not superficial ones like carbon trading and recycling and so on. Uh, and so the question, do we have alternatives? Are there ways of meeting human needs and aspirations without trashing the earth and without causing the kinds of deprivations and inequalities that the current models have done? And basically, we try and sort of look at this in two ways. One form of alternative is resistance itself. This picture is from the late 1980s in central India on the river Indravati, where 300 indigenous people villages protested against the proposed two mega hydroelectricity projects, which would have displaced those 300 villages and drowned all the forests that you can see in the background. Now, in their articulations, what was very interesting was not just that they did not want to be dispossessed and displaced from their territories, but also that while the river was a commodity for the government, for them, the river was their mother. And so you actually see two very different civilizational outlooks to how we look at the rest of nature, right? Is it something that we have kinship with, or is it simply an object which we can produce, which we can exploit? And in the process of such resistance movements, also challenging not just this dam or that mining project or that highway, which is going through my agricultural land, but saying there are the fundamental structures that underlie the pushing of these sorts of processes, whether it's capitalism, state domination, racism, patriarchy, etc. Those are the ones that we have to challenge and provide also alternatives to. So if you see such movements across the world, anti-racism movements, the climate justice movement, the youth movements, the movements for peace, movements for new constitutions, such as in Chile and elsewhere, and here the iconic farmers movement. Actually, you see this kind of an articulation of not just what we are saying no to, but also what is our vision of our relationship with each other and with the rest of nature. But along with these movements of resistance, we know that people also have needs and aspirations that need to be met. There are hundreds of millions of people who go hungry to bed every day, and other kinds of deprivation. So the second kind of alternative that we look at is what one would call constructive alternatives, creating projects and processes which meet these needs and aspirations. And there are literally tens of thousands of these across the world, most still undocumented or relatively less known, but more and more of these are actually surfacing, coming up. I am going to give a very short glimpse of some of these, just like taking a minute on each of them. And because I think it's really these grounded examples and initiatives that bring out
Ashish
the hope and
Kothari,
inspiration, right? And tell
Auroville
us what.
Global Fellowship or something.
Peter,
Peter,
can
could you
you
mute yourself?
I am muted. I'll mute off.
Not you, Peter Lloyd, Peter Clarence Smith. Sorry.
Okay, so one of the most inspiring for me in the last 35 years or so is this one in Telangana in southern India, where 5,000 Dalit women farmers, I think since you're all have been in Auroville in one way or the other, you would know the caste system in India. So as Dalit women farmers, they are actually the most marginalized section of India's society. Until about 35 to 40 years back, they were facing very severe situations of hunger, malnutrition, no access to education, health, etc., and of course, social exploitation and marginalization. Till they started forming sanghas or women's committees in about 60, 70 villages, started sharing their seeds, decided that they did not want to go into the chemical green revolution farming because it was unsustainable and it was destroying the earth. So going back to their traditional varieties, especially millets, sharing knowledge and basically putting everything into the commons rather than privatized. Long story short, they have been able to achieve complete food security for 5,000 families, but also beyond that, food sovereignty, which means complete control, local community control over seeds, land, water, and knowledge. So no corporate control, no government control. In Central Asia, another very inspiring movement, which is in the middle of one of the most war-torn zones of the world, the sort of quadri junction between Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, where a very large Kurdish community has been persecuted for a long, long time by all the four nation states. But they are trying to create a Kurdistan, a free Kurdistan, based on eco-feminist principles, which they call genealogy, and based on radical democracy, where every settlement takes its own decisions. And I'll come back to that in a minute, the framework of radical democracy. But also very interesting because when they started their freedom movement, they thought they would want to create a new country, a Kurdish country. But within a very few years, they actually realized that creating a new country with its own government and nation state would basically again centralize power. So instead of that, they've been arguing for a stateless society, which is really what radical democracy is about. Coming back to India, looking at an urban example, and some of what's happening here, I think would resonate with some of what's happening also in Auroville. So basically, Bhuj is a exploding town in Kutch in Western India. And with all the problems of slum settlements, of lack of access to water, to adequate energy, to waste disposal and management, and dignified housing. So here, as part of a program called the Homes in the City, there was a lot of decentralization of power where these, especially the poorer colonies of that town, have been able to take some matters in their own hands, do their own planning, build their own much more dignified housing, create water self-sufficiency, try and deal with things like waste, become in some cases zero waste, and energy and so on. But the most important thing is the social transformation, which is about empowering all the people in these communities, especially also the girls and the women, to be part of decision making and not leaving that decision making to bureaucrats and politicians who otherwise rule the city. Over into Europe, these are some really fascinating examples of non-capitalist businesses or ways of living within, of course, a very capitalist society. So this factory in Greece has been run by workers. This is a sort of olive oil based cleaning detergents factory, and they run it democratically in the sense all the workers are equal partners in decision making, and they all get the same wage per hour of work, regardless of what the work is. I don't have the time to go into all of these, but the top left-hand side, a commune that I visited last year in Germany, and this is one of 200 communes where they're trying to share instead of having every family having its own car, its own washing machine, etc. They say, how do we share the resources? Can 10 families share a washing machine and a car? And can we actually share childcare? Can we share grandparents, the care of the elders, without having to pay for it? So actually reducing significantly the need for money in many of the essential needs and which otherwise have to be paid through a capitalist system. Now, one of the most essential parts of this, of course, is also education, because finally, this is where we all learn as kids in our families or in our schools, which is where we learn what are values or the lack of them. What are our aspirations as we grow up as a human being? What is it to be a human being, actually? And we know that most schools, certainly in India, are extremely uncreative, are basically drudgery, as opposed to, say, the Mahatma Gandhi's views on what should be education, which is something that you work not just with your head, but also your hands and your heart. So essentially becoming more holistic human beings, being a sense of responsibility, but also having fun while doing all of that, expressing one's own creativity. So these are some examples from different parts of the world. I know Auroville itself also has some examples like this, but these are places where people are trying to have created alternative learning processes in which these aspects of fun and creativity and more holistic transformations can be put in. So, one thing that we do often is to look at the original meanings of words. I'm sure some of you know this, but the original meaning of the word school, it comes from skole in Greek, and it meant leisure or learning with leisure, which is really the opposite of most schools, at least in India. Finally, then, of course, the field of communications, art, technology, and media. We know that these are also heavily controlled by corporate agencies or by governments, depending on which part of the world you're in. There's very little scope for freedom of expression from the general public, say, or for the general public to actually get to know various dimensions of something. So we're basically fed what corporate houses want to feed us. So these are examples of alternative spaces for technology, media, and etc., where people are trying to have their own voice coming out. So in India, for instance, more than 150 radio stations are run by communities. Not all of them very well, but those who are run well are very interesting, where the community has the space, the freedom to actually put their own perspectives, their knowledge, their songs, their cultural performances, etc., on a radio, which goes out to 100, 200, 300 villages. Similarly, many other forms of alternatives in these spaces. Okay, let me just spend the last 5-6 minutes to look at, on the basis of these examples. If I had more time, I would have given you at least a dozen more examples from all over the world. On the basis of these sorts of examples, what one comes up with is alternative frameworks, alternatives to the mainstream model of development and governance. And basically, it looks a bit like this. So we call this the flower of transformation, where we're looking at changes taking place in 5 spheres of life: political, economic, social, cultural, and ecological. And of course, all of these intersecting, they're not looked at separately. And at the core of this flower of transformation, perhaps the most important part, which is that of ethics, values, and principles. So let me give a little bit of detail on each of these. I'm just going to do like, a minute each. So if you look at the political, what is argued in the Kurdish movement and many other indigenous movements or other community movements in the world is that democracy is not so much about going to elections and hoping that the party we elect will do the right thing. And if not, then in the next election, we elect some other party in. But it's actually about us claiming power where we are. We are the decision makers. Now, I know that, of course, Auroville has been also an attempt at doing that. But this is really flipping the whole idea of liberal democracy or neoliberal democracy, which unfortunately most countries have accepted in the world, where it's really all about elections and intense party politics and things like that. Now, in the process of doing that, of course, one has the question that you can do this at a localized level, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 residents, right? But on larger scales, you would still need to have representative institutions. So how to make those representative institutions accountable to the grounded institutions is also something that there's a lot of interesting experimentation taking place in the Kurdish movement, in the Zapatista movement in Mexico, in many indigenous movements, in central India, where 90 villages have got together to form a federation of village assemblies, where they're trying to see, okay, how do representatives not become powers unto themselves, but actually are responsible and accountable to the units on the ground. Now, having radical political democracy is not adequate unless there is also the democratization of the economy, which means that workers should actually have control over their means of production, whether it's in agriculture and forestry, or it's in industry or services or whatever. As consumers, we need to know what we're consuming instead of just blindly going to a supermarket and eating something, or consuming something which we don't know where it's come from, what is going into our bodies, etc. As people who engage in exchange without money, people who actually do caring and sharing in the economy without it being acknowledged, especially women, as for instance, are acknowledged and are respected. So bringing back the economy of caring and sharing rather than finance and money being at the core of the economy. And if one does that, then going beyond GDP, all countries except Bhutan use GDP or percentage economic growth as a means of, as an indicator of development, which is completely nonsensical. You can have very high rates of growth with, still 50% of the population not having enough to eat, as is the case in India. The third part of the flower of transformation is social justice. We know that in countries like India and many other parts of the world, there are a lot of traditional inequalities, whether gender, caste, etc., and new ones, digital inequalities and others. So dealing with these inequalities, fighting for more equality, fighting for less discrimination, for more justice between people who have so-called disability and those who have so-called ability, all of these also form part of the transformations and have to go hand in hand with the first and the second. The fourth sphere, or the fourth petal of the flower, is culture and knowledge diversity. Unfortunately, over the last few hundred years of colonialism, we have come to believe that modern science and technology is the only valid knowledge in town. We've come to believe that English is probably, or English and Spanish and French are the only valid languages to speak. They are the languages of power, and so on. So trying to actually demolish those myths and sustain the incredible diversity of cultures, languages, knowledges, ways of being, ways of knowing, ways of dreaming that do exist or did exist in the world, and many still do. So that's also part of the transformations. India alone has about 780 living languages, right? Not dialects, but full languages. How do we sustain those? How do we actually celebrate those? Because they're all living libraries of knowledge. And finally, and for me, the most important, radical ecology, which is to say, again, over the last couple of 100 years to 300 years of certain kind of Western modernity, we have come to believe that we are superior, that we are separate from nature, or that we are on top of some sort of a ecological or biological pyramid, which is the figure you see on the left-hand side. Note that it's a man on top. Whereas, in fact, indigenous peoples, local communities have always believed that we are a circle of life, with all species to be equally respected. So how do we reintegrate ourselves within nature and respect the integrity, the spiritual connections, the kinship with nature. I just want to give you a very quickly this event that happened to me last year. I was down in Kerala at the Adirapalli waterfall and taking photographs of these bonnet macaques. And there was this baby monkey very close to me. I was taking photos. Then at some point, I felt that, look, I need to, I need to see if I can reach out to this baby. So I put my camera down. I reached out. My colleague was saying, be careful because the mother is there and they can be aggressive. This baby first bent down and smelt my finger and then reached out and touched me with its own finger. And in that, well, for a very, very obviously a split second, in that split second, I felt it was eternity in a second, right? That it actually brought me home to my own roots in the earth, which is well beyond the human, which is the earth as a whole, which is millions and billions of years of evolution or processes that have actually created me as I am right now. So it's really about bringing this back in center stage in everything that we do. Now, if we put these 5 spheres together, we basically come up with a very interesting question of how do we look at political boundaries? So South Asia, as an example, and you can take this anywhere in the world, as an example, is where political boundaries for pre-colonial or colonial reasons have cut across rivers, mountain chains, nomadic populations of wildlife and of people. Basically, flows, ecological and cultural and economic flows have been disrupted by the creation of national political boundaries. And we have to be able to question that. And see, okay, how do we actually have political decision making in a way that biological and cultural and ecological flows can be reconnected? We can start seeing South Asia again, not as the picture on the left-hand side, but as the picture on the right-hand side, or a combination of the two. Obviously, this is very difficult to do on the ground, but it has been happening and is already happening in some parts of the world. And then, as I said, at the core of this flower of transformation is the ethics and the values, possibly the most important part of what I've learned from all these examples all over the world, which is really that it's not about me copying and emulating exactly what the Kurdish women are doing or the Dalit women farmers in Telangana are doing, but really learning the values, the ethics, the principles emerging from them, the processes emerging from them, and then trying it out in my own area. So I'm not going into all of these in detail and just putting some up. It's really what all these examples are saying. It's about cooperation and not competition. It's about the commons, not about privatization. It's about interconnected as various kinds with each other as people, but also the rest of nature. It's about the rights of not just human beings, but also of nature as a whole. And so on. So it's peace, non-violence. There's many different, and I'm sure you all can add more values to this. But basically, if we look at all of this together, then it comes back to something that I think Natasha mentioned, which is worldviews that celebrate life. And for me and a lot of us working in this, the celebrity are not the Elon Musks of the world, but that Dalit woman farmer who on 2 acres of land is feeding her entire family of 10 people with no chemicals, keeping the earth intact, keep knowing holding the seeds and the earth to be sacred, and doing all of this without any way causing harm to nature or to people. That woman is the celebrity. In India, we've had a notion like this or a worldview like this for at least 1,000 years. Swaraj, which essentially, well, very badly translated means self-rule. But what's very important is, as Gandhi elaborated during the independence struggle, that Swaraj is not just freedom, individual community freedom. It is freedom with responsibility. Because if I exercise my freedom in a way that takes away your freedom, then that's not Swaraj. Right? So what we've done is to kind of extend that to say, okay, eco-swaraj, which is to say the responsibility not just towards other human beings, but towards all of nature. And that's why radical democracy, but radical ecological democracy. Radical being going to the roots in the way that I explained to you earlier, and but ecological in the sense of responsibility towards all of nature. So this is, I mean, of course, it's a simple definition, but obviously very hard and complex and nuanced to do on the ground. There are similar worldviews all over the world. I will put up a book at the end, which some of you may have already seen, which has 100 examples. So these are from ancient indigenous peoples across the world. They are reinterpretations of major religions, as is happening in right now. For instance, liberation theology in Christianity or socially engaged Buddhism. But there are also counter currents coming from within the industrialized capitalist West, such as degrowth or ecofeminism or eco-socialism. And what binds them together is not that they are all part of one big umbrella kind of a movement, but it's a pluriverse. So each of them is unique, but they all kind of share the values and the ethics that I spoke about earlier. Now, one question I often get asked is, it's fine that there are these thousands of examples, but how do we make macro change happen? How do we confront the big economy and the big politics of the world, right? Right now, what's happening with more and more authoritarianism, etc. And for us, I think what's very important and learning, especially also from the anti-colonial movements of the late 20th century, early 21st century. No, where am I going? Sorry, late 19th century, early 20th century, or the anti-patriarchal movements, all of which started small, started scattered, but then began to gather steam and momentum and became global forces. And this is incidentally in the days in which there was no instant social media. So that's what I call outscaling, where you're learning from each other. You're trying to create your own initiatives and experiments of resistance and alternatives, and then you're connecting horizontally across to be able to create that larger and larger scale. It's happening with organic farming and the other examples I already gave. And to me, I think the ecological movement is in that sense like this, because the more people realize we are in this severe crisis of ecology, the more the possibility of both resistance and alternatives emerging, grounded, decentralized, but then connecting with each other. So finally, then one attempt that we have we started 10 years back in India to try and create this kind of a greater partnership, learning from each other, collaborations, collective visioning, advocacy is Vikalp Sangam, or the confluence of alternatives. We have had about 30 confluences, physical confluences, people meeting each other. The one that you see on the right-hand side in white, Economies in Jan 2020, was actually held in Auroville. But these have been held in many, many different parts of the country with several thousand people having been involved in them. We do documentation of transformation stories. It's very important for us that these stories come out, that people know about them. So, in the midst of this atmosphere of gloom and doom, we know that there is some hope and inspiration. This website has now about 2,000 stories of positive change in across India. We do joint visioning. What's the sort of society we want? So bringing these, there are about 90, 100 organizations in this process, bringing them together to say, what's our collective vision of what India could look like? So this keeps evolving. It's right now in its 7th version. Doing advocacy. So earlier this year, we released a People's Manifesto for India in light of the national elections, which is a hope not just to try and influence political parties and governments, but more importantly, actually civil society itself, movements themselves actually taking on the courage and the holistic visions to make transformations happen. We have a film that was just recently released, and I will put the links in the chat when we finish. It's called Churning the Earth. It has 6 examples of alternatives across India. Now, learning from this, we also then initiated something called the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, which is worldwide. So Vikalp Sangam in India, meeting up with Crianza Mutua in Mexico, with Masa in Southeast Asia, and other similar movements with similar objectives of collaboration, joint visioning, more critical mass, etc. So let me end with these 2 books. The book on the right-hand side, which is now available in 7 languages, is about 100 essays of alternatives from around the world, very short essays, including many whose examples I gave. And on the left-hand side is a book where 40 people have envisioned the future of India in 2100 on different topics, gender, conservation, agriculture, food, health, education, etc. And then come back to now and say, okay, how do we get there? How do we get to that kind of a utopian, idealistic vision? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? So it's a sort of a utopian visioning, but very firmly grounded in current reality. So that's it from me. Sorry, slightly a bit more than time than I should have taken, but I hope I've been able to give a glimpse of some aspects of radical ecological democracy. Thank you very much.